This story is wild. And yes, it's based on true life events. How would you scream if you discovered that your husband, the one you buried with your hands, is alive and living in another town, with a wife and 3 kids? Yes, 3 kids. Sit back and listen to this breathtaking story. In the bustling heart of a modern African city, where the streets buzzed with honking cars, hurried footsteps, and the endless rhythm of life, Bernard lived with his wife, Grace. Bernard was a man of action, his strong hands hardened by years of relentless work. Despite the grind, his mind was always racing, chasing dreams that felt bigger than the world around him. Grace, on the other hand, was a pillar of quiet strength and unwavering faith. She was kind and deeply prayerful, the type of woman who believed that with patience and trust, life would unfold as it should. But after 14 years of marriage, their home was too quiet, a silence that echoed louder than any noise. There were no cries of a baby, no cheerful shouts of children playing. It was a silence that cut deep, even though neither spoke of it openly. For Grace, the solution was prayer. She spent her days visiting spiritual leaders, fasting, and seeking divine answers. "God's timing is perfect," she would tell Bernard, her voice gentle yet firm with belief. But Bernard's patience was thin, worn down by years of waiting. "What timing, Grace? 14 years and nothing. Maybe this isn't about prayer. Maybe we need to act, spend money, see doctors, find a real solution." Grace would lower her head, her sigh barely audible over the tension that seemed to fill the air. She loved Bernard, but she knew his restless nature all too well. He wasn't cruel or unkind, just a man who couldn't sit still, always looking for the next thing that might change their lives. Bernard worked as a construction foreman, a job that demanded every ounce of his strength and skill. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, barely. His days were spent under the harsh sun, shouting instructions and solving problems, and his nights were filled with dreams of something bigger. One dream in particular had consumed him for years, landing a contract for a massive mansion project. It was the kind of job that could change everything, promising a payout beyond anything he had ever earned. For years, Bernard had chased this opportunity, talking to contacts, attending meetings, and keeping his name in the right circles. Then, one afternoon, his phone buzzed with the call he'd been waiting for. His heart raced as the voice on the other end confirmed it. He had won the contract. Bernard was overjoyed. He could barely contain himself as he rushed home, bursting through the door with excitement. "Grace! Grace, you won't believe it," he shouted, pulling her into a tight embrace. "This is it. We're finally going to be rich. I'll buy you new clothes, a bigger house, anything you've ever wanted." But Grace didn't share his enthusiasm. Her face was etched with worry as she stepped back. "Bernard," she began softly, her voice tinged with hesitation, "are you sure this is a blessing? I've been having dreams, bad dreams about this project. I feel like something isn't right." Bernard's excitement faltered, replaced by a frown. "Dreams? Grace, this isn't about dreams. This is real, tangible money. This is the opportunity I've been waiting for all my life. I can't just let it go because of some bad feeling." Grace looked at him, her eyes filled with quiet concern, but she didn't argue further. She knew how determined Bernard was, how much this meant to him. Still, her heart felt heavy, weighed down by the uneasy feeling that no amount of money could shake. Construction began with an energy Bernard hadn't felt in years. He arrived early each day, overseeing the team, making decisions, and even lending his own strength to the work. For the first few weeks, everything seemed perfect. The mansion's framework began to rise, and Bernard felt pride swell in his chest. This was his legacy in the making. But then, things started to shift. At first it was small, almost laughable. A wrench missing here, a hammer misplaced there. The workers shrugged it off as forgetfulness. But as the days passed, the incidents grew stranger. Tools would vanish entirely, only to reappear in odd places. Workers began whispering among themselves, their voices low but tinged with unease. "I heard footsteps last night," one of them confided to Bernard, "but when I looked around, no one was there." Another swore he saw a shadow darting between the pillars, moving too quickly to be a person. "I'm telling you," the man said, his face pale, "there's something wrong with this site." Bernard dismissed their concerns with a wave of his hand. "Superstitions," he said firmly. "Let's focus on the job. We've got deadlines to meet." But the rumors didn't stop. One night, the foreman called Bernard, his voice trembling over the phone. "I saw it too," he said. "Shadows. They were moving, but there was no one there. Bernard, this place, it's not right." Bernard felt the weight of the foreman's words, but he refused to let fear dictate his actions. He told himself it was just stress, the workers' minds playing tricks on them. Yet Grace's warnings lingered in the back of his mind, and they grew louder when he had a dream of his own. In the dream, Bernard was standing on a tall scaffold, overlooking the construction site. The ground below seemed impossibly far away. He felt a presence beside him and turned to see a dark figure, its form unclear, but its voice chillingly precise. "This land is ours. Turn back before it's too late." Bernard woke up gasping for air, his heart racing. His body was drenched in sweat, and his hands trembled as he wiped his face. He tried to shake it off, convincing himself it was just a nightmare brought on by exhaustion. "This is nothing," he muttered to himself, staring at the ceiling. "Just my mind playing tricks." But deep down, a flicker of doubt had taken root. And as the strange occurrences continued, Bernard began to wonder if this project would cost more than just his time and effort. He was blinded by money and fortune. Despite the unsettling occurrences on the site and the gnawing doubt that occasionally surfaced, Bernard pressed on. His resolve hardened with every passing day. He had invested too much into this project to back out now. The mansion was halfway complete, and Bernard convinced himself that these challenges were just tests of his resilience. 5 weeks into the project, Bernard climbed the scaffold to inspect the roofing work. It was one of his routines. He trusted no one more than himself to ensure everything was done perfectly. Below, the workers watched nervously as he ascended. "Boss," one of them called out, pointing at the wooden planks, "that wood looks unstable. You shouldn't go up there." Bernard waved off their concerns with a confident laugh. "Don't worry," he shouted down to them, his voice steady despite the height. "I know what I'm doing." But the moment Bernard stepped forward, the wood beneath his feet groaned ominously. A sharp crack echoed across the site, and before he could react, the plank gave way. For a fleeting second, Bernard felt weightless, his arms flailing as the world tilted. The ground below seemed impossibly far, yet it rushed up to meet him with terrifying speed. The workers screamed his name, dropping their tools and rushing to where he lay. Bernard's body was motionless, crumpled like a rag doll. Someone yelled for an ambulance, and a frantic call was made. At the hospital, Grace arrived, her face pale and stricken with dread. The doctors worked tirelessly, but the injuries were too severe. Hours later, the news came. Bernard was gone. Grace collapsed into a chair, tears streaming down her face. Her heart broke, not just for the man she had loved, but for the warnings he had ignored. The dream, the whispers, the shadow, they had all pointed to this moment. As she sat there, clutching a small cross in her hand, Grace whispered a prayer through her sobs, asking for peace for Bernard's restless soul. The mansion project was abandoned, left as a skeletal reminder of ambition unchecked. And though Bernard had always dreamed of building something that would last forever, his true legacy became a cautionary tale about the cost of ignoring the signs. Years after Bernard's death, a strange man surfaced in a distant town. He was a quiet laborer, working tirelessly at construction sites, earning just enough to keep himself afloat. Guess what? It is Bernard. Yes, the dead Bernard. No one knew where he had come from or how he had arrived in the town. People believed he was a wanderer who had lost his memory, living a life pieced together from fragments of the past. One day, Bernard met Amina, a vibrant woman with a cheerful spirit that lit up the bustling local market. She was everything Bernard wasn't: open, full of laughter, and unburdened by the weight of the past. Her kindness drew Bernard in like a warm fire on a cold night. Over time, they grew closer, and within a year, they were married. Life with Amina brought Bernard a sense of peace he hadn't known before. Together, they built a modest but happy life, raising 3 beautiful children who filled their home with the laughter and joy Bernard had once longed for. He became a devoted husband and father, throwing himself into his new role with the same intensity he once reserved for his ambitions. But while Bernard gave his all to his family, he avoided any talk of the life he had left behind. Amina would occasionally ask, her curiosity piqued by his reluctance, "Don't you want to see your family? Shouldn't our children know their grandparents?" "They live very far away," Bernard would reply, his voice tight with tension. "It's better this way." Amina sensed that Bernard's past was a closed door he wasn't ready or willing to open. She respected his silence, but questions lingered in her mind. What could have driven a man to bury his past so completely? And why did shadows sometimes seem to linger in Bernard's eyes, even in moments of joy? Though he tried to embrace his second chance at life, Bernard couldn't entirely escape the specters of his past. They loomed in the quiet moments, whispering of debts unpaid and questions unanswered. Yet for now, he focused on what was in front of him: his family, his work, and the fragile peace he had built in this second life. Still, in the darkest hours of the night, when the world was silent and Amina and the children slept, Bernard would sit alone, staring into the shadows. And in those moments, he wondered, was this new life a blessing or a curse that would one day demand its price? Amina was a woman of quiet strength, and though she respected Bernard's silence for years, she couldn't ignore the ache in her heart. Their children, growing up full of curiosity and questions, deserved to know the roots of their family. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues across their modest home, Amina decided she could no longer wait. As they sat together in the small kitchen, the sound of their children's laughter drifting in from the next room, Amina turned to Bernard. Her eyes brimmed with tears, her voice steady but pleading. "Please, Bernard," she said, reaching for his hands. "Let me meet them. Let me know the people who raised you, the place you came from. Our children deserve to know where they come from. They deserve to feel connected to something bigger than us." Bernard froze, his breath catching in his chest. The walls he had carefully built around his past felt as though they were closing in on him. Memories he had fought to bury began to surface. The sound of Grace's voice, the echo of his own ambition, the dark whispers on the wind. "Amina," he began, his voice shaky, "there are things I can't explain, things I don't want to face." "But you won't face them alone," she said, her grip tightening on his hands. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together, as a family. Don't you trust me?" Bernard hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't articulate the unease that gripped him every time Amina spoke of his past. Was it fear of being discovered? Guilt for leaving behind the life he once knew? Or something far darker that he couldn't even begin to name? Finally, seeing the sincerity in her eyes, Bernard let out a heavy sigh. He nodded slowly. "All right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll take you. But promise me you'll accept whatever you find. No questions, no judgments, just accept it." Amina nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. Relief washed over her, but a faint shadow of unease lingered. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how painful or strange it might be. And so, a journey that had been delayed for years began, with Bernard guiding his family toward a past he had long tried to escape, a past that refused to let him go. The family packed lightly, filling a single suitcase with essentials, and set out on their journey. The children were excited, chattering about the adventure, but Bernard was unusually silent. He spent most of the trip staring out the window of the bus, his expression distant, as if he were gazing into a world only he could see. Amina watched him closely, her heart heavy with a mix of curiosity and concern. What kind of place were they heading to? What was Bernard hiding? After hours of travel, the bus finally stopped at a remote village surrounded by lush greenery and dusty roads. The air was thick with the scent of earth and distant wood smoke. Bernard stepped off the bus first, taking a deep breath as if bracing himself. Pointing to a narrow, overgrown path winding through the trees, he turned to Amina. "Go down that path," he said quietly. "Ask for Bernard. Someone will take you to the right place." Amina frowned, her confusion clear. "What do you mean? Aren't you coming with us?" "I will," Bernard said, avoiding her gaze. "But first, I need to visit an old friend. There's something I need to take care of." Amina wanted to press him, to demand answers, but something in his tone stopped her. It wasn't defiance, but a quiet resignation that told her he was battling something deep within. Reluctantly, she nodded and took the children's hands, leading them down the path. As she walked, the whispers of the village grew louder. A few passers-by gave her curious looks, their eyes flicking between her and the children. "Bernard," they murmured among themselves, their voices tinged with confusion and a hint of fear. Amina stopped at a small hut at the end of the path, where an elderly man sat weaving a basket. "Excuse me," she said politely. "I'm looking for Bernard. Can you help me?" The man froze, his hands pausing mid-weave. His eyes, sharp despite his age, scanned her face and her children. "Bernard?" he repeated, his voice a mix of disbelief and caution. "You mean Bernard, the foreman?" "Yes," Amina said, her heart pounding. The man's expression darkened, and he motioned for he pointed to Bernard's parent house. He whispered to himself confusedly, "Those kids look like Bernard." But Bernard never had a child. Left with no choice, Amina gathered the children and followed Bernard's instructions. The path led them to a modest house with cracked walls and a rusting tin roof. Amina knocked hesitantly, the sound echoing in the still air. The door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman whose eyes widened the moment they landed on Amina and the children. Her wrinkled hand flew to her chest as if to steady her heart. Who are you?" the woman stammered, her voice trembling. "I'm Bernard's wife," Amina replied, her voice steady with pride. "And these are his children." The old woman gasped audibly, her face turning ashen. She stepped back, clutching the doorframe for support, as if the very ground beneath her feet had shifted. "You must come inside," she whispered urgently, beckoning them in. The room was sparse but warm, with the faint scent of herbs lingering in the air. The woman offered them water and food with shaking hands, then excused herself abruptly, murmuring something about needing to gather the family. Minutes later, the house was filled with people: Bernard's brothers, his father, and finally, Grace, his former wife. Grace's face crumpled as her eyes landed on the children, her breath hitching in her throat. She took a trembling step forward, her fingers grazing the air as if reaching out to touch them. "They look just like him," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. Amina, sensing the gravity of the moment, began to explain who she was and how Bernard had brought them to this village. But as she spoke, Grace's face changed, confusion turning to disbelief and then to something darker. She shook her head slowly, her voice thick with sorrow. "That's impossible," Grace said firmly, her eyes brimming with tears. "Bernard died years ago. I buried him with my own hands." Amina felt the world tilt. "No," she said, shaking her head vehemently. "That can't be true. He's alive. He's the one who brought us here." The room fell silent, the weight of Grace's words hanging heavily in the air. Bernard's brother stepped forward, his face grave. "If you don't believe us," he said quietly, "we'll show you." They led her and the children to a small graveyard behind the house, where the air felt colder and heavier than before. The family stopped before a simple grave marked by a weathered wooden cross. "This is where we buried him," Bernard's brother said solemnly. Amina stared at the grave, her mind racing to make sense of what she was seeing. Her knees felt weak, and her hands trembled as she pulled her children closer. "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. This can't be real." But the grave stood there, silent and unyielding, a stark testament to a truth she could not yet comprehend. Amina collapsed to the ground, wailing in disbelief. "It's not true. It can't be true." The villagers gathered, talking quietly about spirits and curses. They remembered what their elders had said long ago. If someone dies in pain, with unfinished dreams or a heavy heart, they might be given a second chance at life in a new place. But there was a rule: they must never meet anyone from their old life. Some even believed the spirit that haunted him at the construction site was the same one that brought him back from the dead. Grace stood silently, her face a mask of pain and confusion. Amina stayed in the village for days, hoping Bernard would reappear, but he never did. Broken and bewildered, she returned to her town, carrying the burden of a truth she could neither understand nor accept. And in the quiet village, Bernard's grave remained, a silent reminder of a man who lived two lives but belonged fully to neither. Bernard never came back till today.